Before we dive in, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a sketchy experience with an online listing or marketplace? Something that made your instincts scream danger, even though everything looked legitimate on the surface? Drop a comment and share your story. Your experience might help someone else avoid the same mistake. And if you're new here, welcome to the channel. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I post true horror stories like this regularly, and you definitely don't want to miss them. One more thing before we begin, these stories get progressively more disturbing. The first one is unsettling. The second one is worse. And the third one, well, you'll see. So get comfortable, turn up your volume, and whatever you do, remember this. The next time you see an online offer that seems too perfect, ask yourself why someone would be so generous to a complete stranger. Because sometimes, the price they're asking isn't money. Story 1. The Free Housing Arrangement. This first story comes from a young woman I'll call Rachel. It happened in 2017, when Rachel was 21 years old and going through what she describes as the lowest point in her life. She dropped out of college during her first year, a decision that had basically destroyed her relationship with her parents. Her mother and father saw it as throwing away her future, and their disappointment turned into genuine anger that poisoned every interaction. Rachel wasn't speaking to her family anymore. She had only a handful of close friends she could trust. And she was working a dead-end job at a vape shop, barely making enough to survive. She describes this period as her apathy era, a time when she'd kind of lost the will to care about much of anything. One day, while mindlessly scrolling through Craigslist during a slow shift, Rachel saw an ad that immediately caught her attention. The post was from a man named Jackson who was advertising free lodging for a young woman willing to watch over his house and handle basic cleaning duties. Essentially an au pair or house sitter, but without having to watch any children. The listing included about 10 photos of the house, a modest, middle-class, single-family home that looked slightly old-fashioned but well-maintained and comfortable. But the photos weren't what grabbed Rachel's attention most. It was the fact that this position offered completely free living in exchange for housework. No rent, no utilities, no financial burden whatsoever. And perhaps most appealing to Rachel at the time, no background check required. Looking back, Rachel admits she didn't ask her family or friends for their opinion before responding to the ad. She just texted the number listed on the posting. This Jackson guy responded within minutes. Rachel expressed interest and asked basic questions about the arrangement. He had detailed answers to everything, which actually made Rachel feel more confident about the legitimacy of the offer. But fairly early in the conversation, he asked what her gender was. When Rachel said female, his responses seemed to get noticeably longer and more enthusiastic. Rachel didn't care at the time. Most people prefer having a female housekeeper or nanny, it's a common bias in domestic work. She rationalized it away immediately. Jackson explained that he wouldn't be home during the day most of the time due to his work schedule. He wanted to come home to a clean house, and he mentioned he wouldn't mind occasionally coming home to a cooked meal after long shifts. Rachel was fine with all of that. If it meant free housing and escape from her parents' constant judgment, she'd happily cook some food and keep a house clean. Plus, Jackson said he'd pay for all the groceries. Rachel would just need to do the shopping and cooking. It was starting to sound almost too good to be true. Jackson suggested Rachel come by later that same day to see the place in person and determine if it would be a good fit. Rachel agreed immediately. A few hours later, she was driving her beat-up Civic to Jackson's address. The house was in a perfectly normal area of town, the kind of quiet, middle-class neighborhood where people keep their lawns trimmed and kids ride bikes on the sidewalks. The neighboring houses had flower gardens and seasonal decorations suggesting normal, stable families lived there. Good start, Rachel thought. She rang the doorbell, and when the door opened, she was greeted by a man who was both larger and significantly older than she'd pictured. Rachel had imagined a regular-looking 45-year-old dad type. Instead, this was a man probably in his early 60s, about 6 feet tall, with a gray beard and a slight beer belly. But he greeted Rachel with a huge smile and immediately went in for a hug, even though they'd literally just met in person for the first time. The warmth of his greeting actually put Rachel at ease. He seemed friendly, grandfatherly almost. Jackson showed Rachel around the house. It was a 2-story layout. The first floor had your basic kitchen, dining room, and living room setup, nothing fancy, but clean and functional. Upstairs, there were 4 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. Jackson showed Rachel the guest room she'd be using and the bathroom, but the other doors upstairs remained closed during the tour. He mentioned that if Rachel ever needed to use the office across the hall, she was welcome to. Down the hall was his bedroom and another room that he didn't explain at all, just gestured vaguely toward it without opening the door. Rachel was surprised to learn there was only one bathroom for the entire house. That seemed like it could get awkward, but she didn't mention it. Finally, Jackson showed her the basement entrance. He said it was unfinished and that he only used it for working out and doing laundry. That was the end of the tour. Notably, Jackson didn't show Rachel the backyard that day. Rachel told him she wanted the position, and Jackson immediately said she was hired. 2 days later, Rachel came back with all her belongings packed into her car. When her parents asked where she was going, Rachel told them she'd gotten an apartment. She didn't explain anything more, and they didn't push for details. Their relationship had deteriorated that much. The first night in Jackson's house was when Rachel noticed the cameras. They weren't hidden, at least not as far as Rachel could tell. They were just small black security cameras mounted in the corners of the living room and kitchen, visible if you looked for them. It made perfect sense to Rachel at the time. Jackson was letting a virtual stranger live in his house. Of course he'd want some security and the ability to check in remotely. Still, Rachel wished he'd mentioned the cameras during the initial conversation or the house tour. Their presence made her feel slightly weird about the situation, though she immediately rationalized the feeling away. If you can't tell yet, Rachel really wanted this arrangement to work out. That first night, when Rachel went to bed in the guest room, she noticed how much noisier the house felt compared to when they'd toured it during the day. She could hear the wood floors creaking periodically. At one point, she was certain she heard what sounded like a door closing somewhere downstairs. Rachel checked her phone, 1:30 a.m. She came up with rational explanations in her head. When you're lying in silence trying to sleep, you notice sounds you'd never pick up on during the day when you're occupied with activities. Plus, every old house makes settling noises, expansion and contraction from temperature changes, that sort of thing. The next morning, Jackson was already gone like he'd promised. He'd left a note on the kitchen counter with a list of tasks he wanted completed. Normal stuff: do his laundry, vacuum the floors, wipe down the kitchen counters and appliances, dust the living room. Rachel tried to focus on the positive. She wasn't standing behind a retail counter dealing with difficult customers anymore. This was easy work. She did Jackson's laundry first, then cleaned the floors and wiped everything down. After completing the tasks on the list, Rachel went back upstairs and started making the guest bedroom feel more like her own space. She unpacked her clothes, set up her laptop on the small desk, put a few personal items around to make it feel less temporary. Rachel remembers thinking, maybe this could actually work out. For the first time in months, she was being genuinely positive about her situation. After finishing everything, Rachel relaxed for a while and watched YouTube videos on her laptop. Not hearing her parents yelling from downstairs or having one of them burst through her door barking orders at her, that felt like a genuine breath of fresh air. The first week went pretty smoothly overall. At night when Jackson got home from work, they'd make small talk about basic things. Nothing ever got too deep or personal. He'd ask about where Rachel grew up, what she wanted to do eventually career-wise, general getting-to-know-you questions. Rachel cooked dinner several nights in a row, and Jackson seemed genuinely appreciative. She started thinking maybe she just overreacted about the cameras and the slight weird feeling. Everything seemed fine. But the peaceful dynamic didn't last. One night, Rachel made pasta with chicken and some vegetables. She tried her best, but cooking wasn't exactly her strong suit. She was a young, angsty girl who'd never been taught much about meal preparation, not some experienced home chef. When Jackson got home that evening, he looked tired and irritated before he'd even tasted the food. He took one bite, and his entire facial expression changed. "This tastes bland," he said flatly. Rachel apologized and offered to add more seasoning or make something else entirely. But Jackson snapped at her. "If you're going to be living here for free, the least you could do is learn how to cook something edible." He pushed the plate away and stood up abruptly. Then he told Rachel to clean up the mess she'd made in his kitchen before he walked away toward his bedroom without another word. The outburst caught Rachel completely off guard. It wasn't just what Jackson said, it was how rapidly his entire personality seemed to shift. He'd seemed so easygoing and friendly before that moment. Rachel quietly cleaned everything up and hoped Jackson had just had a bad day at work. Everyone has bad days, she told herself. It didn't mean anything. The next morning, Rachel actually apologized to Jackson. She didn't really think she'd done anything wrong, but she wanted to keep things smooth and avoid conflict. "I'm sorry about dinner last night. I'll try harder with the cooking." Jackson just laughed like the previous night's anger had never happened. Then he said something that made everything feel deeply wrong. "Maybe you could make it up to me by cleaning the house in your underwear today." He said it with a smile, like it was supposed to be a harmless joke. Rachel remembers freezing completely, her brain struggling to process what she just heard. "I'm not comfortable with that," she finally said. Jackson laughed again and told Rachel to relax, that he was obviously joking, then headed off to work. Rachel stood there after he left feeling profoundly unsettled. It was the first time she really thought that maybe there was something genuinely wrong with Jackson beyond just being occasionally moody. That was also the first time Rachel texted one of her close friends about the living situation and what Jackson had said. Her friend's response was immediate and unambiguous: "You're insane for staying there. Leave as soon as possible." But Rachel didn't want to leave. As weird as things were getting, she still felt like she had more control over her life there than she'd had living with her parents. Going back home felt like admitting failure all over again. The following Monday, Rachel was leaving the house to go grocery shopping with money Jackson had left for her. As she was driving down the street, a car behind her started laying on the horn aggressively. Rachel thought she'd done something wrong while driving, but the car kept following her, honking intermittently. Rachel started getting genuinely scared that something was seriously wrong with her vehicle or that she'd somehow offended someone. She pulled over to the curb. The car pulled up directly behind her, and a young woman got out and approached Rachel's window. She looked to be around Rachel's age, early 20s. The woman walked up and immediately asked, "Are you living at that house?" When Rachel confirmed that yes, she was, the woman's expression became deadly serious. "You need to stay away from that man. Right now." What the woman told Rachel next made her physically sick. Apparently, Jackson wasn't even his real name. This woman had been in the exact same arrangement before Rachel, the previous live-in housekeeper. She'd eventually realized that Jackson had cameras watching her constantly, far more than just the obvious ones in the kitchen and living room. She said Jackson started knowing things he shouldn't know, private things, personal things that could only be explained if he was watching her 24/7. When she tried to leave the arrangement, Jackson made it extremely difficult. He kept asking invasive questions about where she was going and when she'd be back, pressuring her to reconsider, making her feel trapped. Then the woman told Rachel the worst part. One night, she'd woken up in the middle of the night and seen Jackson leaving her bedroom. Just standing in her doorway, then walking away when he realized she'd woken up. Rachel felt her stomach turn. But the woman wasn't done. She said Jackson didn't actually have a job. He'd been lying about going to work every day. The previous housekeeper had eventually realized that Jackson was still somewhere inside the house most days, she just didn't know where. Maybe the basement, maybe one of those closed rooms upstairs. But he wasn't leaving for work like he claimed. Rachel sat in her car trying to process everything she was hearing. Every little weird thing suddenly started making horrifying sense. Rachel asked how she could leave without causing problems or putting herself in danger. The woman told her to act completely normal. Start slowly removing important belongings so Jackson wouldn't notice anything missing. When Rachel finally left for good, she should make it look like she was just running errands, casual, no big suitcases, no obvious signs of permanent departure. And most importantly, don't confront Jackson. Don't let him know you're aware of what he's doing. After the woman drove away, Rachel just sat alone in her car for several minutes, trying to calm down before returning to the house. When Rachel walked back inside, the entire atmosphere felt different. She felt like she was being watched even more intensely than before. That night, Rachel carefully checked her room the way the other woman had suggested. After a few minutes of searching, Rachel noticed something small on the top shelf of her closet, pushed back into the corner behind a box. When she moved the box slightly, she saw it, a tiny black camera lens pointing outward through a small drilled hole. Rachel slowly put the box back exactly how it had been, pretending she hadn't seen anything. Needless to say, she didn't sleep at all that night. She lay in the darkness staring at the ceiling, wondering what she'd gotten herself into and who might be watching her at that very moment. And Rachel is genuinely glad she didn't fall asleep that night, because at some random hour, probably around 3 or 4 a.m., she heard her bedroom door creak open. Rachel flipped onto her side and looked toward the door. Jackson was standing there in the doorway, just watching her. When he noticed Rachel looking at him, he quietly apologized for waking her and closed the door. Rachel lay there in terror, wondering what he'd been planning to do. What would have happened if she'd been asleep? She needed to get out immediately. The next morning, Rachel started executing her escape plan. Every day when Jackson left the house, or claimed to leave, Rachel would bring one small bag of belongings out to her car. Just normal everyday items, nothing obvious enough to raise suspicion. 3 days later, while Jackson was supposedly at work, Rachel left the house and never came back. Though based on what she now knew, Jackson could have been hiding somewhere inside the house. watching her pack up and leave. Jackson texted Rachel later that day asking where she was. Rachel kept her response simple and non-confrontational. She decided to move back in with her parents, and she thanked him for the opportunity. Jackson kept texting, asking why she was leaving, saying she should at least come talk to him in person before making a final decision. Rachel never responded again. About a week later, Rachel noticed something that still bothers her to this day. She got an email notification saying someone had attempted to log into one of her old online accounts, an account she rarely used anymore. The login attempt originated from the same town where Jackson's house was located. Rachel immediately changed all her passwords and security questions for every account she had. Rachel doesn't know what Jackson's real intentions were. And honestly, she doesn't want to know. Nothing technically happened to her, she escaped before anything explicitly dangerous occurred. But Rachel genuinely believes that if she'd stayed longer, something eventually would have happened. Something terrible. So if you ever see deals like that offering free housing from strangers online, just remember, nothing like that is ever really free. There's always a price. The question is what they're actually asking for. Now before we move on to our